Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome into a new episode of Capitol View, a weekly webcast brought to you by the Daily Journal and djournal.com. Coming to you about this time every Monday, talking state government. The state legislature, of course, is in session right now down there in Jackson. And Bobby Harrison, our Capitol Bureau Chief, is here again to fill us in on what's happening. A lot of things to cover here. I'm Brad Locke, your host. First off, Bobby, how you doing? Have a good weekend?
I did, Brad. Had a great weekend. Happy President's Day.
To you as well, sir. Happy President's Day to everybody, which apparently means you get out of school, which I don't remember getting out of school for President's Day when I was a kid.
I did not either, Brad.
Bobby. But whatever, that's fine. We're going to talk about the state budget today. We're also going to talk about transportation funding, which is a big issue, as well as education funding, which of course is a huge issue, probably the issue of this session right now. So let's start off with the state budget. Of course, the new fiscal year coming up July 1st, Bobby, and the state budget writers are trying to piece together a new budget, and they face a lot of challenges. I mean, putting together a budget is just challenging in and of itself. Okay. I mean, just my own budget. I got 5 kids. I know about how challenging it can be to make everything work. But there's some big issues facing the state budget writers too, isn't there?
There's huge issues, Brad. Some people might say they've been acting like kids, but that's just a matter of how you look at it. But they're working now to put together a budget, and the revenues just are still down. Darren Webb, the state economist, met with the legislature last week to give a update. He didn't really have a good explanation of why the revenues continue to be down, but he wasn't hopeful that they were going to pick up for the end of the year. If they don't pick up, there's a possibility that the Governor Bryant, he's already made 2 cuts in this current budget year, which goes through June 30th. And there's a possibility he may have to make another one in addition to, all the budgets being passed, in the first stages. I mean, they're just getting started on passing the budget. So, I mean, they go through a lot of stages before the final budget work. And they'll also look at the revenue again before they have a final budget. But right now, it's like just about every agency is going to suffer a cut. And these are in addition to big cuts they've already had in the past. So it just doesn't look good right now for keeping all the state programs up and running.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder how much more some of these agencies can take as far as cuts. I mean, you mentioned in your article the other day about the Medicaid and the shortfall they have this year, which they're going to get some help from some of these lawsuit settlement funds, about $40 million supposed to be directed toward the Medicaid. But still, how big an issue can this become for some of these agencies if he has to make yet another round of cuts?
Well, Medicaid in particular, I mean, Medicaid has a deficit every year, so I wasn't so alarmed about it
Sure.
Up at this point. But, they've been talking about a $75 to $85 million deficit. And what the legislature has passed so far is around $45 million for that deficit. And Medicaid is one of those programs where you can't most of the money in Medicaid goes to pay for sick people. So, I mean, it's not like you can just cut out travel or a bunch of employees and save the amount of money that you need to save to prop Medicaid up. When you start talking about cuts in Medicaid, you're talking about cutting, medicine or some type of healthcare service. So that'll be a big deal if they don't deal with the Medicaid issue. Which they don't want to get into the money, but there's reserve funds they could tap, or there's also other options they could have. So it's not dire yet, but it's not a good situation right now for the state budget writers.
Yeah, and of course, Governor Bryant has dipped into the rainy day fund a couple of times, at least recently, and that's something you certainly don't want to get into the habit of, Bobby. I mean, you start kind of setting a bad precedent when you have to make cuts and then dip into the rainy day fund again and again.
Yeah, and they want to keep that rainy day fund up around $250, $300 million. But at some point, mental health's already cut some services. Department of Health cut some services, and when the folks at universities, IHL, they say matter of factly that when they get the cuts, they make up for tuition increases. So I mean, there's even though it may not be quite as obvious as it could be in the future. I mean, there's already been impact of the budget cuts that's been made by the governor and the legislature, and it unless the revenue picks up, it could be bigger consequences down the street, down the road, highway somewhere.
Yeah, what's the timeline on getting this budget knocked out and figured out?
Well, there's several steps. There's more than 100 bills that fund state government, and half of them start in the House, half of them start in the Senate. And by Wednesday, I think it is, the House has to pass its half, and the Senate has to pass its half, and then they swap bills. And then, right now, these deadlines. There's several deadlines on the way, but the final deadline is sometimes in late March, right before the legislature session ends, when they're supposed to get this budget passed. So there's less than about a month and a half to, or maybe not even that long, that they have to get this settled.
Let's talk a little bit about infrastructure needs, road and bridge repairs in particular. A lot of roads and bridges in Mississippi need to be fixed or replaced, and of course that's been a big issue, is trying to fund all these needs. And the Mississippi Economic Council had a plan that has not been accepted. They want to spend an extra $375 million a year. That's not going to happen right now. Some positive news is that the tax collections on internet sales could provide a bit of a boost. In fact, Philip Gunn, the House Speaker, said last week, I believe it was, that that's pretty much going to be the only source of extra revenue for road and bridge funding right now, Bobby, which I guess could be 125 million a year, perhaps.
Right, somewhere around there, 125 million at tops, probably closer to 100 million, Brad. And of course, this is the right now, while it's the law that if you purchase something on the internet, you're supposed to pay that 7% tax on it. It's not being collected right now in most instances, and this bill is try to convince the retailers to collect the tax for the state. The big internet retailers, and it passed the House with the money, and the money in the legislation would go to road and bridge repairs, both on the state level and on the local level. And right now that bill is pending in the Senate. And I think Speaker Gunn was sending a message, if you want some money for road and bridges, you need to convince the Senate to pass this legislation. There's a lot of opposition to it, primarily among conservative groups, but also some Democratic legislators also have been opposed to it, because they say this is, imposing a new tax, while the people that support the legislation say it's not imposing a new tax, but it's just trying to make it easier for the state to collect the tax that's already the state's already entitled to under current law. Yeah. So we see how that goes in the Senate in the coming days.
What's interesting about this is they've got Amazon now voluntarily collecting the tax, and they're trying to convince more internet companies to do the same on their own. And if that's what happens, and then the legislation doesn't become necessary, well, then you have the problem of maybe that money won't get diverted to the infrastructure needs, because the legislation says, okay, we want to divert all that money to the transportation department. But if you don't have that legislation, if it becomes unnecessary, then I guess, Bobby, that money might just go elsewhere.
Right. That's a good point, Brad. That's a real good point. Like I said, under current law, the tax is supposed to be collected already. It's just that there's really not a good mechanism to collect it.
Right.
But under current law, the money would just go to the general fund, which, while it wouldn't go to road and bridges, it would definitely help the general fund, based on the conversation we just had about the budget. So it could be used there too, to fund education, healthcare, and Medicaid and mental health and all those things, public safety. But there's a lot of people want that money to go to infrastructure. But for it to go to infrastructure, this legislation has to pass.
Yeah, and and if the internet retail companies do decide to voluntarily pay this tax, again, that then just under the law, that money, like you said, would go to the general fund. But they could still try to get some legislation passed even then, couldn't they, Bobby, to try to at least to say what to do with these funds?
Yeah, but you're running out of time. I mean,
Sure.
this bill's already alive. It's passed one chamber, so I mean, this is the best vehicle to do that. At this point, there's still time to introduce a new bill, but I don't know why. I'm not sure it would make sense to introduce a new bill when the bill that's passed the House is already out there
Right.
that
Right.
can be used. And you talked about Amazon, Brad. The estimate is that Amazon, is going to be able to provide an extra $15 to $30 million, $15 million to $30 million a year for the state general fund just by it voluntarily collecting the tax. So that'll be a boost for a needed boost for the state. The question is, does that money go to the general fund, as you said, or does it go to designated for road and bridge repairs?
And speaking of funding issues, let's talk a little bit about education. Of course, we've got the whole education funding formula rewrite process that's going on. And as your story noted from over the weekend, Bobby, no bill to fund the schools has passed yet. In fact, they're putting that off. House Speaker Philip Gunn says it makes more sense to couple that with whatever they come up with for the funding rewrite, which have some people are suspicious of that, Bobby, but what's kind of his reasoning behind it?
Yeah, he said that the two should be coupled. That you don't know how much money the school should get until you do that formula rewrite, and so he said that for that reason that probably the formula rewrite and the funding of the K through 12 schools would be done in a special session, perhaps a special session within the session, but a special session.
Yeah,
and that surprised a lot of people. I mean, that came from the speaker, and I don't think Lieutenant Governor's office knew he was going to say that, or even his own appropriations committee chair. So, some people are concerned that the formula rewrite is going to be such a contentious issue. A lot of people think the existing formula, the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, is sufficient and does a good job, and they're fearful of it being rewritten. And so there's going to be an anticipated pretty big fight over the rewrite of the education funding formula. And some people are afraid that it just the flat out money going to the local school districts, get caught up in that, it could cause some problems for funding the local schools. And so not everybody's on board with the speaker's decision, but he's a speaker and he carries a lot of weight.
And education funding accounts for what, about a third of the state's budget? You're talking about $2 billion plus dollars.
The general fund budget, yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
Okay. Just want to get the numbers out there. And you mentioned there seemed to be a little bit of lack of communication. The appropriations chair for the House, John Reed, apparently was not aware of what Philip Gunn was going to do. In fact, just a few hours, just reading from your story here, a few hours before Gunn made that announcement, Reed was telling reporters that he intended to take up an education funding bill the very next day. So
right.
It'd be a little awkward.
I think he was caught off guard, and I think Lieutenant Governor's office and the people in the Senate were caught off guard too. And there's nothing that would prevent the Senate from going ahead and funding education. So we'll see if they decide to do that. If they follow the lead of the speaker and wait for a special session, we'll see. Obviously they could pass. The Senate could pass it on its end, but then it would still be up to the House to complete that legislative process. But it could put pressure on the House to do that outside before the special session if the Senate decides to take up education funding.
Yeah, because that bill usually originates in the House, doesn't it?
Yeah, that bill originates in the House by tradition.
Okay. Well, one thing that Gunn stressed, whenever they do come up with something, they're not going to just, have this proposal, put it out there and vote on it the next day. They do seem to want to give everyone involved some time to study it over and have time to actually talk about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, he made that point because there's been a lot of consternation, if you will, Brad, that this whole process, which is probably the biggest issue of the session, is kind of being done behind closed doors and not in full public view. So he stressed that he said that there won't be an issue where the formula is completed on a Monday, and then on Tuesday they vote without the legislators being able to look at the formula to see how it affects their particular school districts. So that's a key issue, and he committed that the individual legislators would get a chance to see how the change in the funding formula would affect their school districts. Would they get more money, less money? Those are important issues for on a local level for every House and Senate member.
Certainly, certainly. So we'll keep track of that. Again, like you said, probably the biggest issue facing the legislature during this 2017 session. Let's close things out, Bobby, with the three things that we like to talk about every week. Things happening in the legislature from the past week, most impactful legislator, most impactful legislation, and the strangest thing to happen down there in the state capitol, Bobby. So let's, I guess, start with the most impactful legislator.
Well, I mean, I'm going to just cover old ground, Brad, but I mean, obviously he's impactful, but, it shows the power the speaker has.
Oh, yeah.
When he can, I mean, this was, in a sense, this is, I want to stress that I don't think the speaker intends to put education funding in jeopardy, and nobody does. But by him doing this, this was not only an impactful legislator, but it's also a strange thing to say, for the speaker to come out and say, we're not going to fund education through the normal process. We're going to put it off for a special session. Yeah. That was there's been several things that happened this session we hadn't seen before, and that was another one of them. So, I mean, I think that it covers two of those three things you want to talk about. I think that the speaker, he's the most impactful legislator, and also he was involved in one of the strangest thing of the week, I think, to just put a halt on funding of the local school districts in the regular session.
All right, then, and most impactful piece of legislation.
Well, something we hadn't talked about today, Brad, and we hadn't talked about it for a while, but you touched on it. You did touch on it when you talked about Medicaid funding. You said that they were using the tobacco lawsuit settlement, not the lawsuit settlements from the Attorney General's office, to help pay for that Medicaid deficit. There's legislation allowed. It's already passed the House. It's pending in the Senate. If this legislation's passed, it would be much more difficult for the Attorney General to file these lawsuits, whether it's against the tobacco companies, drug companies that he says are overcharging the state for Medicaid patients, or just a multitude of issues. And if that legislation passes, it could, the Attorney General normally brings in tens of millions of dollars in lawsuit settlement funds each year that helps fund the budget, and that would be an impact on the general fund if that money was lost because of the legislation that's pending in that Senate right now.
All right, and as you said, Bobby, I guess we've covered the most the strangest thing to happen this past week, the way Gunn went about the whole education funding thing.
Yeah.
And that'll do it then for this episode of Capitol View. Again, coming to you every Monday around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And if you miss it, just watch the replay later in the day at djournal.com. Follow Bobby on Twitter at BobbyHarrison9. I'm on there as well at Brad Locke. Bobby, appreciate your time as always.
All right, Brad, I appreciate you doing it.
And appreciate y'all tuning in. So we'll be back next Monday. Till then, have a good week.